Sunday mornings at Mason's Diner carried the sacred rhythm of clinking coffee cups and whispered prayers over pancakes. Connor Reeves savored these stolen moments with 8-year-old Zoe, watching her paint syrup hearts across golden stacks while autumn light filtered through rain-streaked windows. The air hung thick with bacon grease and small-town contentment. Then the door chimed. 3 men entered like shadows given form. Charcoal suits pressed sharp enough to cut glass, shoes that had never touched honest dirt. They moved with the fluid precision of apex predators, their collective gaze sweeping the diner until it locked onto a solitary figure at table 7. The woman sat frozen, porcelain coffee cup suspended halfway to trembling lips. Her knuckles blazed white against brown ceramic. Fear poured off her in waves that seemed to chill the very air. The lead man's voice shattered the morning's gentle murmur like a stone through stained glass. Evelyn Cross. Time crystallized. Connor's fork hovered above Zoe's abandoned pancakes as something ancient and dangerous stirred in his chest. Recognition born from darker days he'd buried deep. His voice emerged steady, cutting through the suffocating tension. Wrong table, wrong day, gentlemen. The 3 men turned in perfect synchronization, their attention shifting like searchlights finding new prey. The lead figure, silver-haired, 60-something, with eyes that had witnessed too many secrets, studied Connor with the intensity of a jeweler examining a diamond for flaws. His companions flanked him like bookends of menace, hands resting casually near jacket lapels in a way that suggested concealed weapons. The woman called Evelyn Cross remained motionless, her breathing so shallow it barely disturbed the steam rising from her untouched coffee. Zoe looked up from her syrup artwork, sensing the adult tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. "Daddy?" she whispered, her small voice cutting through the silence more effectively than any shout could have. Connor placed his hand gently on Zoe's shoulder, never breaking eye contact with the silver-haired man. The gesture appeared protective, but those who knew how to read body language would recognize the coiled tension in his forearms, the slight shift in his stance that suggested military training buried beneath years of civilian life. "I think the lady's trying to enjoy her breakfast in peace," Connor continued, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from commanding troops in places where hesitation meant death. The diner's other patrons began to notice the standoff. Conversations died mid-sentence, forks paused halfway to mouths, and the waitress behind the counter froze with a coffee pot in her hand. Cedar Falls, Ohio, population 8,712, rarely witnessed confrontations more dramatic than disputes over high school football standings. The silver-haired man smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Vincent Carmine," he introduced himself with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to having doors opened and questions answered without resistance. "And you are?" His voice carried a faint East Coast accent, polished by years of expensive education and refined by decades of getting exactly what he wanted. Connor recognized the type. Power wrapped in civility, violence dressed in designer clothing. He'd met similar men in darker corners of the world, where American interests demanded protection and moral boundaries became inconveniently flexible. "Someone who thinks you gentlemen might be more comfortable finding what you're looking for somewhere else," Connor replied, his Midwest drawl deliberately emphasizing the contrast between them. Evelyn Cross finally moved, her hand trembling as she reached for her purse. Bills scattered across the table as she fumbled for her wallet. A 20, 2 5s, and handful of crumpled ones that spoke of someone carefully managing limited resources. Vincent's gaze followed the money with amusement, as if poverty was a curious affliction he'd never personally experienced. "Miss Cross and I have unfinished business," he said, his tone suggesting that this business was not the kind that could be postponed or rescheduled. The kind that requires privacy and understanding. The pause before understanding carried enough menace to make several nearby diners suddenly remember urgent appointments elsewhere. Chairs scraped against linoleum as people made hasty exits, leaving only the protagonists and a handful of regulars too stubborn or too curious to abandon their morning routines. Connor stood slowly, his 6'2" frame unfolding with deliberate precision. Years of carrying lumber and swinging hammers had built functional muscle beneath his flannel shirt, but it was the way he moved, balanced, alert, ready, that caught Vincent's attention. "Zoe," Connor said without turning around, "why don't you go ask Dolores for some more syrup?" The 8-year-old hesitated, her instincts telling her that something important was happening, something that adults usually tried to shield children from witnessing. But her father's tone brooked no argument, and she slid from the booth with reluctant obedience. Dolores, the gray-haired waitress who had been serving Mason's customers for over 2 decades, beckoned Zoe toward the counter with practiced understanding of when children needed to be elsewhere. With his daughter safely distant, Connor felt familiar ice settle in his veins, the same cold focus that had kept him alive through 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. "Now, gentlemen," he said, his voice dropping to conversational levels that somehow carried more threat than shouting could have achieved, "I'm going to suggest that whatever business you think you have with the lady can wait until she's finished her meal." Evelyn looked up at him with confusion, and something that might have been hope, her brown eyes searching his face for clues about why a stranger would risk confronting obviously dangerous men on her behalf. She was older than he'd first estimated, mid-40s, with premature grey streaking through dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and accumulated worry. There was something familiar about her features, though Connor couldn't place where he might have seen her before. Vincent exchanged glances with his companions, some unspoken communication passing between them. The man to his left, shorter, stockier, with scarred knuckles that suggested extensive experience with violence, shifted his weight in a way that placed his gun hand closer to his jacket's interior. The third man remained perfectly still, but his eyes catalogued everything: exits, potential weapons, civilian positions, possible complications. These were professionals, Connor realized, not local muscle hired for intimidation. They carried themselves with the confidence of men who had eliminated problems much larger than a single carpenter in a small-town diner. "Mr. Reeves," Vincent said, and Connor's blood turned to Arctic water. He hadn't given his name. "Yes, we know who you are, just as we know who Ms. Cross really is, and why she's been hiding in your charming little town for the past 3 months." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Connor's mind raced through possibilities. How did they know his name? Why had they been watching him? And what did they want with the woman who had apparently been living under an assumed identity in Cedar Falls? Evelyn's face had gone beyond pale to a sickly grey color that suggested she was fighting nausea. Her hands shook as she reached for her coffee cup, needing something to steady herself but too nervous to trust her coordination. The cup rattled against the saucer like chattering teeth. "I think," Connor said carefully, "that you've got me confused with someone else." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they sounded hollow. The way Vincent smiled told him that denial was pointless. These men had done their homework, and whatever they knew about him went far beyond what public records would reveal. "Sergeant Connor Reeves, 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment," Vincent continued, with the satisfied air of someone playing a winning hand. 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and 1 incident in Kandahar Province that never made it into your official service record. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. Connor felt phantom pain flare in old wounds, muscle memory of explosions and gunfire that no amount of civilian life could fully erase. He glanced toward Zoe, who was pretending to be absorbed in selecting packets of sugar while obviously straining to overhear adult conversation. How much did these men know? How far back did their research go? And most importantly, what did they want badly enough to risk exposing their own presence by confronting him in public? Evelyn stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with enough force to draw attention from the remaining customers. "This is my problem," she said, her voice stronger than her shaking hand suggested. "Leave him out of it." There was something in her tone, resignation mixed with protective instinct, that made Connor reassess everything he thought he understood about the situation. This wasn't a random encounter or a case of mistaken identity. These people knew each other, had history that predated their arrival in Cedar Falls. The question was whether that history was something Connor could walk away from, or whether it had already trapped him the moment he decided to speak up. Vincent's smile widened, but it was the kind of expression that belonged on documentary footage of predators selecting prey. "I'm afraid Mr. Reeves inserted himself into our business the moment he opened his mouth," he said, "and now we're all going to have a much longer conversation." The diner's bell chimed again as two more men entered, larger than Vincent's companions, with the kind of muscle mass that came from professionally applied violence rather than gymnasium vanity. They positioned themselves near the entrance with casual efficiency, blocking the most obvious exit, while appearing to simply be waiting for a table. Connor counted exits. Front door now guarded, kitchen entrance visible through the pass-through window, emergency exit near the restrooms that probably hadn't been opened in years and might set off alarms. His training automatically catalogued potential weapons within reach: butter knives too dull to be useful, coffee mugs that could serve as projectiles, hot cooking oil from the kitchen if he could reach it. But with Zoe in the building, his options narrowed considerably. Whatever these men wanted, he couldn't risk his daughter becoming collateral damage in someone else's war. "Daddy?" Zoe's voice carried across the diner, high and uncertain. She had noticed the new arrivals and sensed the shift in atmosphere that even children could detect when adults prepared for violence. Connor forced his expression into something resembling calm, offering her a smile that he hoped looked more convincing than it felt. "Just talking with some folks, sweetheart. Stay with Dolores." The waitress had positioned herself protectively near the child, her weathered hands resting on Zoe's shoulders with grandmotherly authority. Dolores had raised 4 sons and buried a husband who died in Vietnam. She recognized dangerous men when she saw them, and her eyes held the kind of steel that came from defending what mattered most. If things went bad, Connor trusted her to get Zoe to safety, even if it cost him everything else. Vincent checked his watch with theatrical precision, as if operating on a schedule that couldn't accommodate much more delay. "Ms. Cross has something that belongs to my associates," he explained conversationally. "Evidence that could prove embarrassing to certain business arrangements. We've tried the polite approach, phone calls, letters, even a visit to her previous residence in Phoenix, but she seems to have developed an aversion to communication." Evelyn's breathing became more labored, and Connor noticed she kept glancing toward her purse as if it contained something more significant than lipstick and house keys. Whatever these men wanted, she had it with her. The question was whether it was worth dying for, and whether Connor's involvement had already made that choice for all of them. The chess game was becoming clearer, even if he didn't understand all the pieces yet. "Maybe," Connor suggested. "The lady doesn't want to communicate because she's got good reasons to stay quiet." He was fishing for information, trying to understand the dynamics before committing to a course of action that might get innocent people killed. But Vincent's laugh suggested that innocence was a luxury none of them could afford anymore. "Good reasons?" he repeated. "Mr. Reeves, I don't think you understand the situation. Ms. Cross, or should I say Detective Martinez, has been conducting unauthorized surveillance on legitimate businessmen. The kind of surveillance that could be considered industrial espionage, or even terrorism, depending on how creative federal prosecutors want to get with their charges. The name Martinez hit Connor like a physical blow. He'd heard that name before, in briefings that had been classified above his clearance level, whispered in conversations between officers who thought enlisted personnel weren't listening. Detective Martinez. The pieces began forming a picture that Connor didn't want to see completed. If this woman was who Vincent claimed she was, then her presence in Cedar Falls wasn't coincidental. She was hunting something, or someone, and her pursuit had led directly to Connor's quiet life with his daughter. The implications made his stomach clench with familiar dread, the same feeling he'd experienced in the seconds before IEDs detonated, when training and instinct screamed warnings that his conscious mind was still processing. "I think," he said slowly, "that you gentlemen need to leave. Now." But even as he spoke, Connor knew the time for peaceful resolution had passed. Vincent's expression had shifted from amst condescension to cold calculation, the look of a man who had decided that negotiation was no longer cost-effective. "Mr. Reeves?" Vincent said, his voice carrying new authority. "You're going to sit down, finish your breakfast, and pretend this conversation never happened. Ms. Martinez is going to come with us for a private discussion about her recent activities. And your daughter is going to continue believing that her father is nothing more than a small-town carpenter with no connection to classified operations in foreign countries." The threat was elegantly constructed. Surrender Evelyn to save Zoe, abandon a stranger to protect family. It was the kind of moral calculus that had defined Connor's military service, where impossible choices were presented as tactical necessities. But civilian life had softened him in some ways, hardened him in others. He was no longer willing to sacrifice individuals for abstract concepts of greater good, especially when those sacrifices were demanded by men who wore expensive suits and spoke in euphemisms about violence. "Counteroffer," Connor replied, his voice carrying the flat tone that had preceded firefights in places whose names never appeared on CNN. "You leave the lady alone, walk out of here, and forget you ever saw either of us. In return, I don't do things that might require lengthy explanations to local law enforcement." Vincent's companions shifted position slightly, hands moving closer to concealed weapons. The mathematics of violence were becoming clearer. Big armed men against one civilian with decades-old training, in a confined space with innocent bystanders, and a child whose safety took priority over everything else. The odds were not encouraging. But Connor had faced worse odds in places where backup was days away, and failure meant death for people who depended on him. The familiarity of impending combat was almost comforting, like finding an old tool that still fit perfectly in experienced hands. Evelyn made the choice for all of them. She lunged for her purse, fingers closing around something inside, as Vincent's men reacted with professional speed. Chairs scattered as bodies moved, and Connor found himself calculating angles and distances with the automatic precision that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments. Time dilated the way it always did when violence became inevitable. Sounds became sharper, vision tunneled to essential details, heartbeat settled into the steady rhythm that preceded controlled aggression. Zoe's scream from across the diner cut through everything else, and Connor's world narrowed to a single priority: protecting his daughter from the chaos about to engulf Mason's diner on what had started as just another peaceful Sunday morning in Cedar Falls, Ohio. The first gunshot shattered windows and coffee cups with equal indifference. Connor dove toward Evelyn as she produced a small pistol from her purse. Service weapon, he noted automatically, not civilian hardware. Vincent's men moved with practiced coordination, but their positioning had been designed for intimidation rather than combat in confined spaces. Connor used their momentary confusion to reach the woman who had apparently dragged him into a war he didn't understand. "Stay down!" he shouted to Zoe, trusting Dolores to keep his daughter safe while he dealt with immediate threats. Evelyn's eyes met his as she rolled behind an overturned table, and for the first time he saw not fear, but grim determination. This was someone who had been preparing for this confrontation, had been waiting for it with the patience of a hunter, who understood that prey sometimes fought back with greater ferocity than predators expected. "Detective Martinez, I presume," Connor said, as bullets splintered wood around their improvised shelter. Her answering smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "FBI, actually, and these gentlemen have been very difficult to find." She checked her weapon with movements that spoke of extensive training and recent practice. "Vincent Carmine runs a network that specializes in trafficking children across state lines. I've been building a case against him for 2 years, ever since they murdered my son to keep me quiet." The words hit Connor harder than any physical blow could have. A child, murdered to silence a federal agent. The same kind of innocent life that men like him were supposed to protect, had sworn oaths to defend. His vision shifted, tactical awareness overlaying emotional response with deadly clarity. "How many rounds?" he asked, nodding toward her pistol. 12 left, plus 1 spare magazine." She glanced toward the kitchen, where Dolores had shepherded Zoe and several other customers to relative safety behind industrial appliances. "I won't let them hurt your daughter," she added, reading his primary concern with the accuracy of someone who understood parental priorities. Connor nodded, trusting her professional competence, while his own training reasserted itself after years of dormancy. 5 hostiles, confined space, limited ammunition, innocent civilians requiring protection. The situation demanded precision rather than overwhelming force, surgical strikes rather than suppressing fire. It was exactly the kind of mission he'd trained for in places where failure meant consequences that extended far beyond personal survival. Vincent's voice carried over the sounds of destruction with undiminished authority. "This doesn't have to end badly for everyone," he called out. "We only need Detective Martinez and her evidence. Everyone else can walk away." But Connor had heard similar offers in Afghan villages where cooperation was rewarded with shallow graves, had learned to recognize false promises dressed in reasonable language. Men like Vincent didn't Carmine understand mercy. They understood only power and its application. The choice was stark: surrender a federal agent to certain death, or fight with odds that favored trained killers over a single veteran and a cop whose backup was measured in hours rather than minutes. Connor had made harder decisions in worse circumstances, had learned to live with consequences that haunted quiet moments between sunset and dawn. "Martinez," he said quietly, "what's the end game here? What evidence do they think you have?" Her answer would determine his next actions, whether this was worth risking Zoe's safety, whether Evelyn's mission justified the potential cost in innocent lives. She reached into her jacket and produced a small digital recorder, its LED display showing 47 minutes of recorded material. "Vincent's confession about my son's murder, plus details about his trafficking network. Names, locations, financial records, enough to destroy his entire organization and put him on death row." Connor understood immediately. This wasn't just about justice, it was about preventing future victims, stopping a machine that consumed children and corrupted everything it touched. The kind of mission that transcended personal safety, that demanded sacrifice in service of something larger than individual survival. "Then we get you out of here alive," Connor decided, his voice carrying the finality of command decisions made under fire. "Whatever it takes." Evelyn nodded, recognizing the shift in his demeanor from protective civilian to something much more dangerous. She had researched Connor Reeves extensively during her months in Cedar Falls, had learned about classified operations that officially never happened, about a decorated soldier who had walked away from military life after witnessing too much darkness. What she hadn't expected was the core of steel that remained beneath his carpenter's exterior, the willingness to stand between evil and innocence, regardless of personal cost. "There's a back exit through the kitchen," she said. "If we can reach it." Her words were cut off by the sound of splintering wood as one of Vincent's men kicked through the kitchen's rear door. No escape route, Connor realized. Whatever happened next would happen here, in Mason's diner, with his daughter watching from behind insufficient cover while federal agents and child traffickers settled their differences with violence that would traumatize Cedar Falls for years to come. He thought of Zoe's drawings on the refrigerator at home, stick figures labeled Daddy and Me, surrounded by crayon hearts and misspelled declarations of love. She deserved better than growing up with memories of her father's death, deserved the chance to become whatever her 8-year-old imagination could conceive. But some fights chose their fighters, and walking away wasn't always an option for men who had sworn oaths that outlived their military service. "On my signal," Connor told Martinez, "you run for Zoe and get her out of here. Don't look back. Don't stop. Don't let anything slow you down." She started to protest, but he cut her off with the kind of authority that had commanded Marines through urban combat zones. "This isn't about your mission anymore. It's about keeping an 8-year-old girl from watching her father die." Martinez met his eyes and nodded, understanding that some sacrifices were non-negotiable, that protecting children sometimes required adults to make choices that ended in shallow graves and folded flags. Connor checked his position, counted his advantages, limited though they were, and prepared to do what soldiers had always done when civilization's boundaries collapsed into primal mathematics of survival. The second wave of gunfire came from multiple directions as Vincent's men coordinated their assault with military precision. Connor moved with muscle memory that transcended conscious thought, years of combat experience guiding his actions as he drew fire away from civilian positions. A butter knife became an improvised projectile that found soft tissue, a coffee pot transformed into a bludgeon that connected with devastating effect. But numbers and superior firepower were tilting the engagement toward an inevitable conclusion, and Connor knew that buying time was the best he could manage under the circumstances. Each second that Vincent's attention remained focused on him was another moment for Martinez to reach Zoe, another opportunity for innocent people to find safety in chaos that had erupted from a peaceful Sunday morning. Martinez moved like the professional she was, low and fast toward the kitchen area where Dolores had created a fortress of overturned tables and industrial equipment. Connor saw her reach his daughter, saw Zoe's eyes widen with recognition and confusion as the strange woman from the neighboring table suddenly became her designated protector. "It's okay, sweetheart," he called out, hoping his voice carried reassurance rather than the desperation he felt. "Go with the nice lady. Daddy will catch up in a minute." Lies came easily when protecting children required deception, when harsh truths served no purpose except to add psychological trauma to physical danger. Zoe hesitated, torn between obedience to parental authority and instinctive resistance to abandoning her father during obviously dangerous circumstances. "Connor!" Martinez shouted over the chaos. "There's something else you need to know." Her voice carried urgency that transcended immediate tactical concerns, information that might change the fundamental nature of their situation. But Vincent's men were closing distance, and time for extended conversation was measured in heartbeats rather than sentences. Connor indicated with hand signals that she should continue moving Zoe toward whatever safety could be found, while he dealt with more pressing concerns about preventing heavily armed criminals from achieving whatever objectives had brought them to Cedar Falls. The specifics of Martinez's investigation could wait until they all survived the next few minutes, assuming survival remained mathematically possible given current odds and deteriorating tactical position. The kitchen door exploded inward as one of Vincent's men attempted a flanking maneuver through the service area. Connor intercepted him with improvised weapons and 20 years of accumulated combat experience. But the fight was brutal and close quarters, the kind of violence that left permanent damage on everyone involved, regardless of who technically won. Blood on linoleum, screaming from civilians who had never witnessed anything more violent than high school football, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with breakfast grease and shattered dreams about small-town safety. Cedar Falls would never be the same after today, would carry scars that federal investigators and trauma counselors could never fully heal. But Zoe would live, and Martinez would have her chance to testify against men who murdered children, and sometimes that was all soldiers could accomplish in an imperfect world. Vincent appeared in the doorway with his remaining men, surveying the destruction with professional detachment. Blood stained his expensive suit, and his silver hair was disheveled, but his eyes remained cold and calculating as he assessed the tactical situation. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Detective Martinez, you're going to give me that recording, or I'm going to start executing civilians until you comply." He gestured toward an elderly man who had been trapped near the front counter, someone's grandfather whose only crime had been wanting pancakes and coffee on a Sunday morning. The mathematics of terrorism: threaten innocents to control enemies, leverage civilian casualties against professional obligations. Connor had seen similar tactics in places where moral boundaries disappeared beneath the weight of strategic necessities. "Let him go," Martinez called out from behind the kitchen barrier. "This is between us." But her voice carried the knowledge that Vincent's threat wasn't empty posturing. These were men who had already demonstrated their willingness to murder children, who viewed civilian casualties as acceptable costs in pursuing their objectives. Connor calculated angles and distances, wondering if he could reach Vincent before the trigger was pulled, whether his remaining strength was sufficient for one final assault that might change the outcome. But movement would expose Zoe to stray bullets, and protecting his daughter remained the overriding priority that constrained all other tactical options. The chess game was approaching its conclusion, and most of the remaining moves led to outcomes that innocent people wouldn't survive. "You have 30 seconds to decide," Vincent continued, pressing his weapon against the terrified civilian's head. "Recording for hostage. Everyone else walks away." The countdown began with mechanical precision, each number falling like a hammer blow against Martinez's professional resolve and parental obligations. Connor met her eyes across the destroyed diner, understanding passing between them without words. She would surrender the evidence to save an innocent life, would sacrifice months of dangerous work to prevent another death on her conscience. The decision was honorable and strategically disastrous, would allow Vincent's network to continue operating while federal investigators began their case again from zero evidence and compromised positions. But honor sometimes demanded accepting tactical defeat to preserve strategic principles that defined the difference between soldiers and murderers. "Wait," Connor said, his voice carrying new authority. "I've got something you want more than that recording." Vincent paused in his countdown, curiosity overriding immediate tactical priorities. Connor stood slowly, hands visible and non-threatening, but his posture radiating the kind of controlled danger that made experienced killers recalculate their assumptions. 3 months ago, a convoy was hit outside Kandahar. $17 million in unmarked currency, destined for Afghan tribal leaders who were keeping poppy fields out of Taliban control. Only problem was, some of that money found its way into accounts traced back to your trafficking network. Vincent's expression shifted from confident control to something approaching concern. Connor was fishing, using fragments of classified intelligence and educated guesswork to construct a narrative that might buy time for Martinez to escape with her daughter. The Army's Criminal Investigation Division has been tracking those funds through international banking systems, Connor continued, inventing details with the confidence of someone who had participated in similar operations. Turns out they lead directly to shell companies that funnel money to men like you. Men who sell children and call it business. Vincent's weapon remained pressed against the hostage's skull, but his attention was now divided between immediate tactical concerns and potential long-term threats to his financial empire. Connor pressed his advantage, understanding that criminals who trafficked in children were often motivated more by greed than ideology, could be distracted by threats to their profit margins. Detective Martinez's recording is just the beginning. CID has financial records that will connect you to funding sources in 6 countries. The bluff was elaborate and dangerous, built on fragments of truth and years of experience with how military intelligence operated in combat zones. But Vincent was considering the implications, weighing immediate tactical advantages against potential strategic disasters that could destroy his entire organization. Connor used the hesitation to edge closer, calculating the physics of violence with professional precision while maintaining the appearance of negotiation rather than preparation for assault. Each step brought him within range of weapons and hostages, closer to the kind of close-quarters combat that favored experience over equipment, training over numbers. Martinez recognized his movement and began shifting position to support whatever action he was contemplating, her own tactical awareness supplementing his approach with professional competence. "You're lying," Vincent said, but uncertainty had entered his voice like acid eating through steel. "Army intelligence doesn't share operational details with small-town carpenters." Connor smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Vincent saw something in his expression that suggested the situation might be more complicated than initial intelligence had indicated. "You researched Sergeant Connor Reeves?" Connor replied. "But did you research Captain Connor Reeves? The promotion that came with classification levels above your source's clearance?" The lie was bold and completely fabricated, but delivered with enough confidence to plant seeds of doubt in criminal minds that operated on information supremacy and careful calculation of risks versus rewards. Vincent's grip on his weapon shifted slightly, and Connor recognized the micro-movements that preceded either surrender or violence. The moment of decision crystallized around them like ice forming on still water. Vincent's finger tightened on the trigger. Connor launched himself forward with everything he had left, and Martinez moved to protect Zoe from whatever consequences would follow. Time dilated into individual heartbeats, each one containing entire lifetimes of memory and regret, hope and determination. The elderly hostage closed his eyes and whispered what might have been prayers or memories of grandchildren who would miss him at Christmas dinner. Dolores gripped Zoe's shoulders with hands that had buried a husband and raised 4 sons, understanding that some moments defined everything that came after. The gunshot, when it came, was both inevitable and shocking, the sound of choices becoming consequences in a world where good intentions weren't always sufficient protection against evil dressed in expensive suits. Connor's impact sent Vincent staggering backward, the carefully aimed shot going wide and shattering windows instead of ending lives. They fell together in a tangle of violence and desperation, 20 years of accumulated combat skills, meeting professional criminal training in close quarters, where technique mattered less than determination to protect what mattered most. Blood and broken glass, screaming and sirens in the distance, the smell of cordite and coffee mixing into a cocktail that would haunt dreams for years to come. But Zoe was safe behind her barrier of tables and adult protection, and Martinez still had the recording that could destroy a network of child traffickers. And sometimes that was all soldiers could accomplish when darkness tried to claim another victory over light. The fight continued with brutal intensity, until exhaustion and injury decided the outcome, leaving survivors to count costs and contemplate the thin boundaries between civilization and chaos. Vincent's men retreated when their leader fell, professional criminals understanding that prolonged firefights with federal agents rarely ended in profitable outcomes. They dragged their wounded boss toward the exit, abandoning their mission in favor of damage control and strategic withdrawal. Connor lay bleeding on linoleum that had absorbed too much violence for one Sunday morning, but his eyes remained focused on Martinez as she emerged from cover with his daughter safely in her protective custody. "The recording," he managed to say through pain that felt familiar from older wounds in distant places. "Make sure it reaches the right people." She nodded, understanding that his sacrifice had purchased something valuable: justice for murdered children, safety for his daughter, and the knowledge that evil men would face consequences for their choices. It wasn't the ending anyone would have chosen, but it was an ending that preserved what mattered most. The federal agents arrived 17 minutes later, followed by paramedics and investigators who would spend months documenting what had happened when a small-town diner became a battleground between child traffickers and the people who refused to let them operate without opposition. Connor survived his injuries, though recovery took longer than he would have preferred, and left him with new scars to match the old ones. Zoe adapted to the trauma with resilience that amazed child psychologists, though she never looked at strangers quite the same way again. And Detective Martinez, whose real name was Detective Angela Rodriguez, whose son Jamie had been murdered 2 years earlier to silence her investigation, finally had the evidence needed to dismantle Vincent Carmine's trafficking network and bring justice to families whose children had disappeared into darkness that most people preferred not to acknowledge. 3 months after the shooting, Connor stood in his workshop running his fingers over a wooden table he was building for a client in the next county. The scars on his hands had faded, but not disappeared, reminders of choices that defined character when everything else was stripped away. Zoe played in the yard outside, her laughter carrying through windows that had been replaced after stray bullets had shattered the old ones. She was different now, more cautious around strangers, more aware that the world contained dangers that parents couldn't always prevent, but still fundamentally the same child who drew hearts with syrup and believed that her father could fix anything that broke. Some innocence had been lost, but core truths about love and protection had been reinforced in ways that might serve her well in years to come. Detective Rodriguez sent postcards from various cities where Vincent's associates were being arrested and tried for crimes that carried life sentences without possibility of parole. The network was dismantled piece by piece, children were rescued from situations that would have destroyed them, and families received news about missing sons and daughters who could finally come home. Vincent himself had died in federal custody before trial, officially a suicide, though inmates who preyed on children rarely lasted long in maximum security facilities, where violent criminals maintained their own moral codes. Justice took different forms, but it still arrived for those patient enough to pursue it through official channels and determined enough to pay its cost when payment was demanded. The partnership between a federal agent and a small-town carpenter had been unlikely but effective, built on shared understanding that some fights chose their fighters regardless of personal preference or tactical advantage. Connor returned to building furniture and raising his daughter, but kept in touch with Rodriguez through occasional phone calls that never quite discussed the details of what they had experienced together. Both understood that certain memories were too sharp for casual conversation, too heavy for words to carry without careful handling. They had survived something that left permanent marks on everyone involved, had witnessed what happened when good people were forced to make impossible choices in circumstances that offered no perfect solutions. Cedar Falls gradually returned to its normal rhythm of small-town life, though Mason's Diner remained closed for renovations that took longer than anyone expected. Dolores retired after 43 years of serving coffee and wisdom to customers who became family over decades of shared meals and conversation. The building would eventually reopen under new management, but it would never again be the sanctuary of Sunday morning peace that Connor remembered from before 3 men in expensive suits had walked through the door with violence disguised as business. Some sanctuaries, once violated, could never be fully restored to their original purpose. But new sanctuaries could be built, and children could learn to feel safe again in a world that contained both predators and protectors. The story became local legend, told and retold with variations that reflected the teller's perspective and moral orientation. Some versions emphasized Connor's military heroism, others focused on Rodriguez's federal investigation, and a few highlighted the ordinary citizens who had found courage when extraordinary circumstances demanded sacrifice from people who had never expected to face such choices. All versions agreed on essential facts. Evil had been confronted and defeated, children had been protected and rescued, and justice had prevailed despite odds that favored criminals with superior resources and fewer moral constraints. It was the kind of story that reminded people why they honored veterans and supported law enforcement, why small towns treasured their safety, and why parents would do anything to protect their children from predators who viewed innocence as commodity to be exploited for profit. For years passed. Zoe grew older and stronger, eventually choosing a career in social work that specialized in helping traumatized children rebuild their lives after experiencing violence that most adults couldn't imagine surviving. Connor continued building furniture with his hands while building character in his daughter through example and unconditional love that provided anchor points in a world where moral boundaries sometimes blurred beneath the weight of complex circumstances. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., Detective Angela Rodriguez continued her work of hunting predators and protecting innocents, carrying the memory of a Sunday morning in Cedar Falls when a carpenter named Connor Reeves had proved that heroes weren't defined by uniforms or badges, but by willingness to stand between evil and innocence, regardless of personal cost. The final accounting was written in lives saved rather than lives lost, in children who grew up safely rather than disappearing into darkness, in the knowledge that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demanded courage that transcended self-preservation. Mason's Diner became a memorial to choices that defined communities and individuals when everything important was at stake. And Connor Reeves, carpenter and father, veteran and protector, learned that some battles never really ended. They just transformed into different kinds of service that honored the same principles he had sworn to defend in younger days when the enemy wore uniforms and operated in foreign countries where American interests required protection by men willing to pay freedom's price with their own blood and sacrifice. The morning sun still rises over Cedar Falls, Ohio, population 8,712 souls who sleep peacefully because some people refuse to let evil operate without opposition. Children still draw pictures of families and hearts. Fathers still cut pancakes into shapes that make daughters smile, and Sunday mornings still carry the promise that ordinary days can contain extraordinary love. The world remains dangerous, but it also contains people like Connor Reeves and Angela Rodriguez, who understand that protecting innocence sometimes requires adults to make choices that leave permanent scars on everyone involved. It's not a perfect world, but it's a world where good people can still make a difference when they choose to act instead of looking away from difficulties that demand courage rather than comfort.